I've been putting potatoes in the ground for going on 23 years. Started with about 4 acres of mixed vegetable ground, built up to just over 30 over time, and potatoes have been part of every single season. I've had years where I pulled enough to fill a walk-in, and years where I stood at the edge of a row and did the math and felt sick doing it. I know what a bad potato harvest looks like. I knew what a bad potato harvest looked like for the first 7 years I was farming, and I didn't know it was bad because I'd never seen what a good one actually was. This video is about what I eventually learned, from a combination of my own failures, other growers, and some farming practices that came out of Russia that most people in this country have never heard of. I'm going to walk you through the whole system, not a tip, not a trick, the whole system, start to finish, in the order it matters. If you're growing potatoes and your yields are disappointing, I want to tell you something that took me years to believe. It's probably not your soil, it's not your variety, and it's almost certainly not the weather. It's your planting architecture. And that's the best possible news, because architecture is something you control. My name is not important, but the ground is. I farm general mixed production: potatoes, brassicas, alliums, winter squash, some small grain when the rotation calls for it. I've worked soil in 3 different states over 23 seasons. I've lost potato crops to late blight, to drought years, and, more times than I'd like to admit, to my own assumptions. The assumptions a person builds up when they learn from a seed bag, instead of from someone who's been doing this longer. I started taking potatoes seriously about 12 years ago, after a neighbor of mine, a man who'd been growing on his family's ground for 40 years, walked my rows and said 4 words I still think about. He said, "You're planting too shallow." That was the beginning of understanding what a potato plant is actually doing underground. Everything I'm going to tell you starts from that moment and from the 12 seasons of deliberate work that followed it. Let me take you back to how I used to plant, because it's probably exactly how you're planting now, and I'm not saying that as a criticism. I'm saying it because I did it myself for nearly a decade. And I did it because every piece of printed instruction I'd ever read told me to. March or April, I'd collect my seed potatoes. Cut the larger ones into pieces with an eye or 2 each. Let them callus on a table for a day. Then I'd open a trench, call it 4, maybe 5 inches deep. Set the pieces in with eyes facing up, space them at 12 inches, cover them, water them, and walk away. 6 weeks later, when the plants were 8 or 10 inches tall, I'd hill. Pull some soil up around the base, bury the lower stem, call it a season. Maybe I'd come back and hill once more if I remembered, and the season gave me time. What came up at harvest was underwhelming. Scatterings of small tubers, some forked, some the size of your fist on a bad day. Every year I had a different explanation. July was dry. The soil in that field runs heavy. And that variety never does well here. And every explanation was partly true enough to believe. That's the dangerous part of a wrong system. It gives you just enough reason to keep running it. Here's what I eventually understood. I wasn't having a hard season. I was running a system that was designed, deliberately for simplicity's sake, to produce exactly what I was getting. The bad harvests weren't a weather problem or a soil problem. They were an architecture problem. And the architecture was my choice. A potato plant does not produce tubers only from its primary root system. This is the biological fact that changes everything once you understand it. A potato produces tubers from every single node along its buried stem. Every node that sits underground, in darkness, in contact with loose soil, in the presence of moisture. That node is a potential tuber site. Plant shallow, and you've got 2 or 3 buried nodes. 2 or 3 production sites. You've built a ceiling into the system before the first leaf breaks ground, and you will hit that ceiling every year you plant the same way. My neighbor walked my rows and said, "You're planting too shallow." What he meant was, you've got 12 inches of productive potential sitting above ground where it's useless. You're giving the plant sunlight when what you need to be giving it is darkness. The stem that's reaching for the sky can't make you potatoes. The stem you bury can. When I started going deeper, 10 inches, 12 inches minimum, and started hilling 3 times across the season instead of once, the math changed. Instead of 2 or 3 active nodes per plant, now I was activating 8, 10, 12. That's not a marginal improvement. That's the entire explanation for the yield gap between a home garden harvest and what I've seen out of Russian kitchen farming practices. Not their soil, not their climate. Their summers are short, and their soils are cold clay. Not exactly prime potato country. What they have is a planting system built around this biology, applied consistently from the moment the seed potato comes off the shelf. Let me walk you through that system the way I run it now, step by step, in the order that matters. It starts 3 to 4 weeks before planting day. Not on planting day. Before. Pull your seed potatoes out of storage and set them in a single layer somewhere with indirect light and a temperature between 55 and 65 degrees. Eyes facing up. Leave them there. This is called chitting, and it's the step that makes everything else work properly. Here's why it matters. A potato stored in darkness eventually sprouts, but those sprouts are pale and long and structurally fragile. They grew fast in low light, putting everything into length instead of building real cell structure. When you plant a pale, spindly sprout, it either snaps during handling or survives the planting, but spends the first 2 to 3 weeks of the season reorienting and building the root foundation it should have had before it ever went in the ground. You've lost a month before anything useful happens. A chitted potato produces sprouts that are short and dark green and thick-walled. They grew slowly under indirect light and built proper structure in the process. When those go in the ground, root development begins within days. The plant establishes fast, extends stem length fast, and reaches the tuber initiation window earlier. In practical terms, you've gained 3 to 4 weeks of functional growing season without changing your climate or your planting date. On my ground, that difference shows up at harvest in a way you don't miss. Keep those sprouts short, no longer than ½ an inch. If they get long before your planting date, you've let them go too far. Move them to cooler storage and slow them down. The goal is compact, vigorous, and ready. Now planting. Dig to 10 inches minimum. 12 is better on ground that drains well. Set the seed piece at the bottom of the trench and cover it with 2 inches of loose, amended soil. Here's the part that feels wrong the first time you do it. Leave the remaining depth of the trench open above the planting. You've got a 10-inch trench, and you've only filled 2 inches of it. That open space above the seed piece is not a mistake. It is the mechanism. As the plant grows upward toward light, you fill the trench in stages, a few inches at a time, always keeping just the top cluster of leaves above the soil surface. Every inch of stem you cover is activating nodes that were waiting for exactly this: darkness, soil contact, moisture. Every activated node becomes a new production site. You're not just planting a potato, you're building a layered yield system, and you're adding new active layers deliberately as the season moves forward. Spacing. Push out to 14 or 16 inches between seed pieces. The standard 12-inch recommendation was designed to maximize plant count per row, not yield per plant. When plants crowd at 12 inches, their root systems overlap during the bulking phase and compete for the potassium and moisture the tubers need to size up. Fewer plants at wider spacing, and the yield per plant increases enough to more than compensate. You end up with fewer plants and a heavier total harvest. I've run the comparison on the same field in back-to-back seasons. The wider spacing wins. Hilling. This is where I wasted the most years. I treated hilling as a maintenance step, something to keep tubers from going green in the sun. That's not what hilling is for. Hilling is how you keep adding buried stem length after the plant is already growing. Every time you pull soil up around the base of a growing plant, you cover more stem, activate more nodes, and add another production layer underground. I hill 3 times now. First hilling when plants reach 6 inches above the soil surface. Second hilling 3 weeks after that. Third hilling just as the plants begin to flower. By the time the plant shifts into its tuber bulking phase, I've activated 8 to 15 nodes per plant, depending on variety and stem length. That's the number that determines your harvest weight. Not variety, not rainfall. Nodes. Now, what's happening underground during the bulking phase, and why most growers lose yield they don't even know they lost. After flowering, the plant stops putting energy into building stems and leaves and redirects everything into the tubers that were initiated at each node. Those tubers begin to expand rapidly, and that expansion requires, above everything else, potassium. Potassium drives cell wall development. Without enough of it during this 6-week window, tubers stop sizing. They don't die. They just stop at a fraction of their potential weight, and you never know it happened because you're comparing your harvest to other harvests that ran the same deficit. I started applying wood ash to my potato ground 12 years ago. Around the same time, I started going deeper and hilling more. Wood ash is a direct potassium source, water-soluble, immediately plant-available. No pH complications in soil that's already running slightly acidic, which most productive ground does. The Russian growers I learned this from apply it before planting, and again at first hilling. That's what I do. One generous handful per plant at planting, one another at the first hilling. The cost is almost zero if you heat with wood. The return shows up in tuber size during those 6 critical weeks. If you're running a balanced granular fertilizer, equal parts nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, you're under-delivering potassium at the exact moment the plant needs it most. The nitrogen and phosphorus are doing their job. The potassium ratio just isn't built for bulking. Wood ash solves that without requiring you to switch your whole fertility program. Moisture timing, and the 2 problems it causes when you get it wrong. Most growers water reactively, when the soil looks dry or when the plants show stress. During the 6 weeks after flowering, inconsistent moisture is the primary driver of 2 problems that cut yield without making headlines. The first is hollow heart. The center of the tuber dies and leaves a cavity. You don't know it happened until you're cutting tubers in the kitchen. The second is cracking. A tuber that stopped growing during a dry stretch resumes fast after rain and splits its own skin. You end up with a harvest that doesn't store and doesn't sell. 1 inch of water twice per week on a fixed schedule during the bulking phase. Not when the surface looks dry. Not when the plants droop. Fixed schedule, delivered deep enough to reach the tuber zone. That consistency is the difference between a tuber that sizes continuously across 6 weeks and one that lurches between growth and stall. I'll add one more thing about water. Stop it completely 2 weeks before you plan to harvest. Wet soil at harvest time means damaged skins and shortened storage. They'll pull the water early and let the ground dry down. Harvest timing, the mistake that cost you everything you worked for. The worst thing you can do is dig as soon as the foliage dies back. I know it's tempting. You've waited the whole season. The plants are brown and collapsing, and it looks like time. It isn't time. What's happening underground after foliage dieback is skin set. The tuber is thickening its skin, preparing to become a storage organ. Dig before skin sets, and you're handling potatoes that bruise when you look at them sideways, that won't store more than a few weeks, and that lose moisture weight fast. Leave them in the ground 2 to 3 weeks after the foliage dies back. Then dig on a dry day. Let them cure on the surface for 2 hours in mild conditions, and move them to cool, dark storage. And the skin you let set in the ground is the reason a potato keeps through winter instead of softening by October. I know some of you watching this don't have field ground. You've got raised beds. You've got containers on a concrete pad. I want to be straightforward. The system doesn't care what it's sitting in, as long as it has depth. In a raised bed with 12 inches of depth, you start your seed piece low. Fill in stages as the plant grows upward, and hill the surface soil as you would on open ground. In a deep container, a 30-gallon grow bag, a large bucket, anything with real depth, fill it 1/3 of the way, plant, and add growing medium as the stem extends. Tip the container at harvest. The biology is identical. The results follow. Here's how it all sits together, in the order you run it. 3 to 4 weeks before your planting date, pull your seed potatoes and chit them in indirect light between 55 and 65 degrees. Sprouts should be short, green, and firm before they go in the ground, no longer than 1/2 inch. On planting day, dig to 10 or 12 inches. Set the seed piece at the bottom with 2 inches of cover. Leave the rest of the trench open. Space at 14 to 16 inches. Apply a handful of wood ash per plant at planting. As the plant grows, fill the trench in stages. keeping just the top leaves exposed. Hill at 6 inches of growth, again 3 weeks later, again at first flower. Apply wood ash again at first hilling. Water 1 inch, twice per week, on a fixed schedule during the 6 weeks after flowering. Stop water 2 weeks before harvest. Leave tubers in the ground 2 to 3 weeks after foliage dies. Dig on a dry day. Store cool and dark. That's it. That's the whole system. I ran the wrong version of this for 7 years. 7 seasons of blaming the weather and the variety and the soil, when every one of those harvests was the predictable output of a system I'd built wrong from the seed piece up. The day my neighbor said, "You're planting too shallow," I didn't change overnight. It took a couple of seasons of adjusting, of watching what happened when I went deeper and hilled more and managed moisture like it mattered. But the harvests started changing. Not dramatically the first year. Dramatically by the third. You don't need different ground. You don't need a longer season. You need to stop putting the plant in the position where it can only do part of what it's capable of and start building the conditions where it can do all of it. The plant knows what to do. Your job is to give it the depth to do it.